This is me, and that's my Game Boy. I was about 5 years old in this picture, but what I didn't know at the time was that the love I had for my Game Boy was going to take me places. It was going to allow me to meet incredible people and travel to incredible places. Hell, it even allowed me to buy a house and tear it all apart and then rebuild it and make it look incredible and then sell it and move to a country I've wanted to move to since I was a kid. And all of that started with a Game Boy. That Game Boy. But today, that Game Boy looks like this. It's reduced to a plastic bag of parts, and obviously, something has to change. Massive thank you to Temu for sponsoring this video. Temu have recently set out on a mission to save YouTubers like me from the unreliability of ad revenue. Thank you, Temu. Oh, and they've also launched an app which claims to give you the best deals ever. I mean, just look at this portable neck fan. Does your neck get sweaty? Do you suffer from sweat neck? For just $7, you can solve that problem. But don't take my word for it. Look at these reviews. Over 800 people have dry necks now. And apparently, if you download the Temu app today, you'll get the neck fan for $1 and free shipping. I don't know if you urgently need to dry your neck, but if you do, just download the Temu app. As well as that, they sell things like this handheld video games console with a 2.4-inch LCD screen for a very reasonable price. I mean, just look at that discount. Temu are also competing to try and sell the cheapest Nintendo Switch online and competing with much bigger sites that you've probably heard of. The regular price on those sites are about $355, and on Temu it's about $320. And if you use my link, you can get it for under $300, and they also give away a bunch of coupon codes that can bring that price down even more. So just check them out and see what you think. So let's go ahead and fix this Game Boy. This is all that I have left of my original Game Boy, and the motherboard as well, which we'll take a look at in a second. I drew Link on the front there. What actually happened was I replaced the shell. It was probably one of my first Game Boy mods, but these cheap Chinese shells at the time were just really bad. So I've always wanted to put it back into the original shell that I had for it. Unfortunately, I don't have that though, so I'm going to be using this silver donor one. But with my top shell piece that I did the artwork on, that'll be enough. I'll feel like it'll be mine. This is the motherboard though, and you can see switches are supposed to have a little nub sticking out, but this one doesn't have it. Luckily, I have this faulty motherboard spare, so we're going to go ahead and remove the volume slider, which is working perfectly on that one. Going to use this little microscope so that I can see what I'm doing a little bit better. I'll just go ahead and set the camera. Now, this is quite a tricky thing to remove because there's so many little legs, and to lift them all up at the same time is very difficult and it's very delicate, so I need to be very careful not to break it. To do this job, I'm going to be using a hot air station with a very finely focused nozzle so that I can just try and heat up the solder on those legs. And this is me actually removing the faulty switch from my motherboard. So I need to be really careful here and clean up all those solder joints so that they're nice and clean and ready for the new slider to go back on. For this, I'm going to use my soldering iron and a little bit of soldering wick, which will just suck up the last bits of the solder on that motherboard. And then we can go over with some isopropyl alcohol and give it all a clean and apply fresh solder to the new switch later on. Now what I'm going to have to try and do is remove that working switch. But this is a very difficult thing to do, to not burn the actual physical switch. And then I needed to clean off all of the excess solder on the switch so that we can put some fresh solder on it later. The actual switch itself was really gross and dirty, so I gave that a clean too. Now ideally in this situation you probably would want to just buy it. You'd probably want to just buy a replacement switch on eBay or something, but I kind of like the idea of reusing as much as I can, and this switch works perfectly. So this is me now soldering it back into place with my soldering iron. It's a very nice job to do actually, I thoroughly enjoyed that. And now let's go ahead and test it. It works perfectly. So what we'll do now is clean up our station. and reassemble the Game Boy. To start with, I'm going to grab the front bezel piece and the action button plate, and I'm going to sit that down and pop in the new hinges. All going well, it should make that nice snap. Now it's time to clean up the screen, which was incredibly dirty. Then I can slide that ribbon cable down into the shell and put the lovely Zelda plate back on the front. I can then replace the screws around the screen's bezel. And finish them off with the little rubber caps. Now that that's all nice and secure, I'll place this little ribbon cable cover over and screw it down into place. And then it's time to reinstate all of the buttons. Don't forget the little light tube. I can then plug the ribbon cable back into the motherboard and lock it into place. And then I can sit it down and screw it in. You then have to place this little thread piece in for the battery cover and the power switch, and then the back housing can go over the top. And that's when I realized I was missing the charging port. Devastated. It was then time to get all of the equipment out again and remove the charging port from the other motherboard. And then in some I slightly lost my mind freak accident, I removed the perfectly working extension port from the Game Boy that was working perfectly fine before. I really don't know what happened to me here. I lost my mind. And then this is actually me doing what I was supposed to do, which was removing the charging port. Once I had done that, I then had to clean up the space on my motherboard so that it was ready for the new one to just slot into. And again, I made things much harder for myself because I also removed the link port, so I gave that a clean up too. And then once all of the solder was removed, I could go over with some isopropyl alcohol on a toothbrush, and it all looks nice and clean again. And then it's time to sit back down the charging port and the link cable port. I could have just told you that I was doing that to make the connection better, but genuinely, I did not mean to do that. It was just a complete mistake. But once those things are set back in place, I can then add some solder to all of the legs, and that's going to make a pretty damn good connection for a very long time. And so there we have it. The charging port and the link port now back in. Anyway, back to reassembling here. Let's go ahead and plug the ribbon cable in and put the motherboard down. We can screw down the motherboard and then screw down the back shell piece. And that is going to conclude this reassembly. And so here it is, my Game Boy. Okay, it's maybe not completely the original one, but it still has all of the character and the actual main component itself. And what's amazing is that I even have things like this. My brother's Game Boy game. He used to write his name on the back. Yeah, he was one of those people. But this is one of my most prized possessions, because I stole it off him.